All right, good morning. We've been looking at the life of Daniel for several weeks and talking about the things that he went through. And if you remember, one of the things we started with was the idea that Daniel had this foundation in his life. In other words, Daniel had an idea of, where he stood and what he stood upon. And yet, despite that, God chose, it was God's decision, that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would come and he would conquer Judah. And Daniel, along with some of his friends, would be taken off to Babylon and there live a totally different life in a totally different culture and with all the straight. In fact, does anybody remember the names of his three friends? Daniel and the other three were named what? Shadrach. And does anybody remember, this is even better, does anybody remember their Hebrew names? Anybody? A little harder, right? Yeah? Okay, we'll get to those a little bit later. But these guys are part of youth who are taken off, and they're totally re-educated and totally redone. But Daniel really becomes a key person in the life of Nebuchadnezzar because Daniel is the one that is able to see things, understand things that Nebuchadnezzar wants to see about the future, and none of his other astrologers and wise men and all can help him with this. But then there's this wonderful story, and I've gone through, so far we've gone through the first chapter of Daniel. We got to the first half of the second chapter, and we're going to skip the third chapter. So, just don't freak out too much, because that's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But we will come back to that story later, but we're going to skip it because it's a great story, really important. It tells a lot about Nebuchadnezzar's, how he saw life and understood life, because you have to remember, Nebuchadnezzar at this time becomes, over a period of maybe 25 years or so, he becomes the most powerful ruler really in all the world. He spreads his kingdom out. He's incredibly successful, but the Babylonians are known for their cruelty and ruling with fear, and this is the man that Daniel is now serving. And then there's this wonderful chapter number 4. Now, if you've never read the 4th chapter of Daniel, you might go read it and you also say, and that's really weird. And it is. So I'm just telling you, there's another vision and another dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and he tries to resolve. But the lesson and the story there of Nebuchadnezzar is so key and so important for you and I, because it's the trap that is the most difficult trap to avoid, and it's also the worst trap that you can fall into. It's the thing that God despises more than anything else, and that is when when people become proud and arrogant and haughty, and they become so full of themselves that they miss God Himself. And as I always love to say, God has no problem. It's a piece of cake. It takes about this much of His power to humble you. And He's really good at it. And God doesn't do it because He wants to hurt you, or because He wants to inflict pain upon your life. But God does it to wake us up and to show us who we are, and more importantly, right, who God is. Because without understanding that, we just live our lives as people, and we just go through life as people, and we see everybody else as our competition, and I'm struggling to gain more than you have, and I'm trying to convince people that I'm better looking than you are, and all these things just kind of roll through our heads and through our lives, because it's us against everyone else if we fail to put God in the picture and understand who God is. And so God often, I think, lets us go through frustrations and struggles and failures, and you don't achieve what you tried to achieve, and you don't win. I know that you say, is this the opposite of one of those positive thinking seminars? It is, just to let you know. But it's a good thing. It's a good thing, because you put yourself in the perspective that you should see yourself and you should understand yourself, the reality of who you are and the reality of your life, as opposed to, if we get so puffed up and so haughty and so, full of ourselves that we just miss, what's most important. So let me take you to the 4th chapter of Daniel. Kind of explain a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. In this chapter, this is like a letter or a statement that Nebuchadnezzar himself puts out, and he wants to make sure that people hear it and understand it. If you even read the 4th chapter at the beginning of it, you think it's a little strange in how it starts. That's because this is really, Daniel's writing it, but this is really Nebuchadnezzar's statement. And let me read for you just a couple of verses. These are not in your outline, just to let you know. If you have a Bible with you in chapter 4, he says this in verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. So yes, because he's powerful. Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was known for one of the 7 wonders of the world. It's called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. I mean, they were just incredible in the things they built and the things, that they did. And he says in verse number 5, he said, I saw a dream that made me fearful. And these fantasies as I lay in my bed and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So here he is. He's got everything. He has won more than anyone else has ever won, in a sense, right? Nebuchadnezzar has power that no man before him has ever experienced in his life. And it's very easy for Nebuchadnezzar to see himself as, I have to answer to no one. I can do anything I want to do. I can live any way I want to live. Everyone, everything on the earth must please me. And there's something human inside of us, I think if you'll admit it, I will admit it, that says, wow, wouldn't that be a great place to be? Wouldn't it be wonderful if you wanted everything? Wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone had to answer to you and you had to answer to no one? Wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone, as they go through their day, had to think, oh man, I wonder what Steve will think of this, right? I wonder if he'll like this. I want to do what if everyone saw life that way? Wouldn't life be wonderful? Anybody? Good, y'all all agree, so y'all are going to take that on as look at me and whatever Steve, okay, no, you're not going to do that. But you're saying, no, I mean me. I'm the one that because Nebuchadnezzar struggles with what we all struggle with. In fact, it goes all the way back to the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, where it talks about Adam and Eve, displeasing God and sin comes in for the very first time. That's the nature of sin. The nature of sin is, but I want life to be all about who? Me. And for a lot of people, that's the kind of God that they look for. They want a God that will make life all about them. Listen, if you find a God like that, it's a con God, right? It's someone setting you up because they would never make life all about you if it were a God. And God knows the best thing in the world that could happen to you and I is to see ourselves as we really are and to see Him as He really is. Actually, that's the definition of humility. Seeing yourself as you really are and seeing God as He really is. Now, I don't like seeing myself as I really am. A lot of times I don't like some of the things that I see. But in perspective, when I see God as He really is, it changes how I understand and how I can deal with and how I can accept me as I really am in light of who God is. So we all struggle with this same thing. Nebuchadnezzar does too. Nebuchadnezzar just happens to be, catch this, he just happens to be really good at it. Better than the rest of us in one sense, right? Because he actually gets there to that place, only to find out that being in that place is not everything that he thought it was, because he starts having these dreams. He said, man, they really bothered me. In fact, fear came into my life. And Nebuchadnezzar, as he's looking at his dreams, starts thinking about, what if I'm not all that? What if it doesn't all work out that way? And Nebuchadnezzar has this vision. He goes to his conjurers, his sorcerers, his wise men, his entourage, and he says, here's this vision. I want you guys to help me interpret this because it really, really, really bothers me. And they can't figure out what it means. And eventually he goes then to Daniel, and he says, Daniel, I need you to help me with this because you've done this before, and it's pretty clear you have an unusual ability to interpret and see things. I need you to help me with this. So here's his vision. I'm going to try to not mess it up too much. His vision is of a great tree that grew on the earth. And it grew to be so tall, reaching to the heavens and spreading out over the entire earth. And its foliage, that means, its leaves and its fruit, shaded all the animals and creatures, everything that lived on the earth, and fed everything that lived on the earth. So the beasts of the field came and gathered under it, and the birds of the air came and flocked in its branches, and it was just magnificent and powerful. And then he says, but a watcher, one of the watchers from heaven comes down and says, cut down the tree. And when the tree is cut down, its branches are stripped off, its foliage is taken off, its fruit is scattered. All of the beasts that live under it, they are scattered. The birds that nest in it, they are all scattered. And then it says, the watcher said, take the stump that is left from it, bind it with iron and bronze, and let the dew of the earth fall on it. Let it be like all the other wild beasts and just be different. And then Nebuchadnezzar, even in his dream, starts referring to him, meaning himself, that he would be like one of the wild beasts and live like one of the wild beasts. And he can't understand what could this be. In fact, he adds in his dream, here's what the watcher says, this verse 17, the sentence and the decree of the angelic watchers and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High ruler over the realm of mankind, and he rules over the realm of mankind, and he bestows on it whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So it's this vision that disturbs him. Maybe there's something greater than me. Maybe there's something more powerful than I am. Maybe I'm not all that. Maybe I can't determine everything. But Nebuchadnezzar is one of those people, I think where we all struggle, but some of us struggle because we're good at it. We're good at winning it most of the time. We're good at achieving, and it's easy then to fall in this great trap of arrogance, of pride, of where our ego, who we are, becomes the most important thing of all. In fact, I will tell you that most of the time, secular humanity, this is secular humanity's highest good or highest goal is the individual's success and elevation and whatever. And the reason I say it's secular is because it leaves out God. It leaves out, but wait a minute, we're just creatures on this earth with puffed up heads and ideas a lot of times. And we're creatures that need some humility in our lives. We need to go through some failures in our lives. Some things that don't work out the way we thought they were going to work out in our lives, so that would change our perspective. And the truth is, you can be better because of it. Because seeing God as He really is and understanding God is a much more secure, less fearful thing than not acknowledging God and wondering one day if it's all going to collapse and it's all going to fall apart. So Nebuchadnezzar goes to Daniel and he asks him to help him with this interpretation. And this is in your outline. And I want to start here and just kind of go through a little bit of what Daniel states, because it says something about Daniel's character as well as Nebuchadnezzar's story. Here's verse 19. It says, upon hearing this, Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, that's his Babylonian name, was overcome for a time, frightened by the meaning of the dream, because he understood it, but he doesn't want to, say what it is. And he says, why? Then he said to the king, Belteshazzar, don't be alarmed by the dream and what it means. But Daniel, Belteshazzar, replied, I wish the events foreshadowed in this dream would happen to your enemies, my lord, and not to you. Now, I like this because I think it still reveals something of the character of of Daniel, one of those guys with a D in his name, and how he sees God. Daniel is able to be absolutely loyal to Nebuchadnezzar, even though Nebuchadnezzar was not a follower of the living God. Nebuchadnezzar was a cruel leader who ruled by fear, who wanted to be, this is chapter 3. He sets up an image and basically says, worship me or worship whatever I set up. And later he even says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, if you cross me, what God is there who can save you from my hand? That's how he saw it. That's just how he understood life. And yet Daniel is incredibly loyal to this man, because that's where God has placed Daniel. He says, this is my life. This is where He's placed me. This is what I do. I didn't pick to go to Babylon. God chose to send me to Babylon. And Daniel is doing the best that he can do, giving his best effort to serve Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, I wish this dream, the interpretation was actually, I wish this was your enemies, Nebuchadnezzar, rather than you. Now listen, I think this is not because Daniel is corrupt or Daniel is misguided. I think it's because Daniel's hope is in God. And he's saying, this is where God has put me, this is where God has placed me, this is the job he's given me to do. I'm going to do the best I possibly can at this job, trusting that God has put me here for a reason and for a purpose. And then look at the next verse. This is in verse number 20. He says, the tree you saw was growing very tall and strong, reaching high into the heavens for all the world to see. It had fresh green leaves and was loaded with fruit for all to eat. Wild animals lived in its shade, and birds nested in its branches. That tree, Your Majesty, he says, is you. For you have grown strong and great. Your greatness reaches to the heavens, and you rule to the ends of the earth. Then you saw a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. So it's a real contrast. Nebuchadnezzar, your fame and your power has grown toward the heavens, but then a messenger from the heavens, comes down to where you are from heaven, saying, cut down the tree, destroy it, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, bound with a band of iron and bronze and surrounded by tender grass. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals of the field for 7 periods of time. Now, most historians and scholars will say this either represents 7 years, this periods of time, or it represents 7 seasons, which would be then about, a year and 3/4, something like that. He says in verse 24, this is what the dream means, Your Majesty, and what the Most High has declared will happen to my Lord the King. You will be driven from human society. See, that's such a picture because for Nebuchadnezzar, it's human society that is his power, that he wants to rule over. It's the lives of people. But he says, God has decided you'll be driven from human society, and you will live in the fields with the wild animals. You will eat grass like a cow, and you will be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time will pass while you live this way, until you learn that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world and gives them to anyone he chooses. But the stump and roots of the tree were left in the ground. This means that you will receive your kingdom back again when you have learned that heaven rules. And then look at verse 27. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. And he gives him some advice, 2 things. He says, first of all, break away. This is from the New American Standard, incidentally, this last verse. I thought it was better in the New American Standard. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness. It's kind of like change your way, Nebuchadnezzar. Stop just looking at yourself and doing things to please you, and your way is law and rule rather than heaven's way, and do heaven's way. Be righteous in your actions. If you want to change your ways, that's the first thing that you do. You don't just say, I'm going to stop my sins or my failures. You have to put something in their place. He says, stop it by doing right. Learn a new way. Act out a new way. And then the second thing he says, and from your iniquities by showing, say this part with me, by showing what? Mercy to the... See, for Nebuchadnezzar, this is a big deal. Nebuchadnezzar ruled over the poor. The poor served him. In comparison, everybody was poor compared to Nebuchadnezzar. But he is totally changing his perspective and says, you need to look at people differently. You need to look at people differently. What is in the New Testament, Jesus asked this question. He says, what is the greatest commandment? You remember what Jesus responded? What's the greatest commandment? Anybody know? Love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, strength. You can keep adding, as much as you want to put in there. With everything you've got, you learn to love the Lord your God, not love yourself with all your mind, heart, strength, soul, spirit. Love the Lord your God. And then he adds this, and I think this is so key. He says, Jesus adds, and he puts the 2 together. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and love your who? Neighbor as yourself. That's interesting, isn't it? Love the Lord your God with everything, and then love your neighbor the same way that you would treat or you would love yourself. See, without the first one, it's really difficult to do the second one, isn't it? Because without the first one, you tend to love yourself. I tend to love myself with all my heart, mind, soul, strength. It's all about me, and no matter how much I get or achieve or recognition or whatever, there's always more to be done and more to be achieved and more that I think will satisfy me and make me content. And so when I finally get that, I'll finally have it, and the next car, that will finally do it, or the next house will do it, or the next promotion. And not that any of those things, there's anything wrong with those things. That's a part of life. That's how you live your life. And you have to live your life. But looking to those and thinking, those things are what will really change my life, and leaving God out of it means, you know what happens to the neighbor part? It's completely left out of it. Because the neighbor becomes your competitor, right? The neighbor's the one that's holding you back from those things that you want, because they're going after the same things. And so he's saying, listen, you just got to, first of all, you got to change your ways. You got to stop doing the things that go against God and start living a life that says, God, how would you want me to live? What is important to you? And then the natural progression of that is then you begin to show mercy. You turn from your iniquities by showing mercy to your neighbor, to the poor, to those who are around you. Your whole attention changes, and it can, because you've taken your focus off of yourself. You put your focus on God, it'll change your attention, change your focus on other people. And then he adds one last little part here where he says, showing mercy to the poor in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. So in other words, he's saying, listen, there still may be a way to avoid what's coming or to hold it off some if you would just learn to do these things. And because these things really are attached to not being prideful, not being full of yourself, but instead of being merciful. Before I get into this too, because then he's going to talk about his fall. How do you know when you're in this state that's a bad state? And we just talked about two things, right? Not spending the time doing the things you know would be righteous in God's eyes, or not spending your time, acknowledging where someone else is and saying, man, maybe God has placed me here to help this person, or to help change this person's life, or to reach out to this person, which would just amazingly change communities and families and people when we show that kind of. How do you know? For me, there's some really key signs. There's just some red flashes that go off in my life. One is when I am angry all the time, I know something's wrong. My anger, I know, comes from frustration, that I think there's more to get, that there's more to have if I only had this. And that makes me frustrated, and then that leads me to being angry in my life. When I drive down the road, it happens every once in a while. Well, it happens a couple times a day, but that's every once in a while. And I'm just, frustrated and angry with other people's driving. You ever get that way? I know something's not right. And normally my first reaction is, yeah, they're not driving. No, that's not what's wrong, right? It's me. It's in here. I'm looking for something, and I want something that I think would satisfy me and make me content and make me joyful in life, but that's not what it is. It's a struggle within me, and that struggle within me always, has to do with me and God. Now, sometimes you're tired. Sometimes you just, got too much on your plate and all. Sometimes you just need a break. But what I've learned most of the time is what I really need is a break from just this part of life, and I need to go and be with God. I need to acknowledge who He is. I need to look to Him and say, God, the truth is you put me here. You placed me in this life and in this place, and you have your reasons and your plans, and what I know is that you've never forsaken me. You've never looked the other way and not acknowledged me. You never ceased to have your hand upon my life, loving me and watching after me and putting me here. Man, what could be greater in life and you put me here in this life, in this position, in this neighborhood, at this company. You put me here for a reason, usually for other people. And I've got a chance to do something which someone else that no one else has a chance, to reach out to. The same is true for you. You can do things. You have an opportunity. God's placed you, whether it's in class at school or maybe being the teacher of the school or in a neighborhood or in a grocery store, and God has placed you there. You can do something that no one else can do. You can do something that no one else can do. If you acknowledge God, and if you say, rather than, live in my rebellion and wanting and trying to fulfill my life my way, if I would just look to God and say, okay, God, what do you want me to do? What can I, and having mercy to the poor. Sometimes the poor that you're going to be around has nothing to do with money. There are a lot of people in life, you've got so much more emotional strength, or you've got so much more emotional collateral in your bank than they do. Or maybe your experiences, because there are a lot of people that have a lot of success and a lot of money and have a lot of tragedy also in their life. But you've got something to give them. I was doing a funeral this week. One of the things that came up, I had several people come up to me, and because family had gathered and friends had gathered, and anytime a tragedy has occurred with families in the church, I can't tell you how many times I go and neighbors come up and say, wow, where did all these people come from? Why would they show up at this house? I said, well, we're all part of a church. And they'll say something like, and y'all don't look like you come from the same, exactly. We're all from different backgrounds and, whatever. But we just show up because we know each other. And we love each other and care for each other, and there's something else that kind of bonds us, together that causes us to look at life that way. See, this is God bestowing riches upon us, because when you're in the midst of tragedy and no one shows up, that's when you realize, no matter how much money you have, no matter how much power, no matter how much position, that there's a poverty in your life, that someone else's mercy might actually help deposit, something worthwhile into their account and into their life. Well, this section I entitled it kind of the greatest, or experiencing the hardest fall of all. And here is what happens is verse 28. It says, all this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king, exactly what was told. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace of Babylon. So this is a year later. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of what? My majesty? Nebuchadnezzar learned anything yet? Probably not. And it says in verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you. That's the idea that I can do anything I want to do. I can call any shot, that I want to call. Sovereignty, he says, has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. Immediately, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers. That might be a good do today, right? If you could do that, but not in his day. And his nails like birds' claws. Wow. So it actually happens to him. In fact, it's a picture of Nebuchadnezzar literally kind of going crazy, losing his mind, losing his perspective. And it was in the midst of him looking around and saying, look at how great I am, but it's not enough for Nebuchadnezzar. And he kind of snaps and everything goes haywire, in his brain and how he's functioning, because he still just can't find what he's really looking for. And then it says in verse 34, but at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, and here's what you do. When you're going through something like this, or you're struggling, look at what Nebuchadnezzar does. This is what happens to him. At the end of that time, this is 7 years later or a year and 3/4 later, he says, I raise my eyes toward heaven. Finally, going through all this, losing his mind, losing, his perspective, losing his position with all of those in his kingdom, he finally looks up to heaven. He acknowledges something. You ever been in that position? Where you just have nowhere else to go and nowhere else to turn, and you finally just kind of look up to God, and you say, God, I can't fix any of it. I can't deal with any of it. I can't change, what has happened. It's not a bad place. It's a wonderful place to be, because you're putting yourself in proper perspective. God is humbling you, but looking up to heaven is putting yourself in the right perspective. He says, I raised my eyes up to heaven. And he says, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. And then he writes this kind of his praise or his song. He says, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth account as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven. And among the inhabitants of earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? He's just put himself in the right perspective. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where you just feel like God is just taken me through some stuff, and he's humbled me so much. Maybe you're laying on your back. Maybe sometimes I've been there where I feel like I'm just laying on my face, and I acknowledge, I look up, and I recognize who God is. And you really just sort of surrender that to God and say, God, you're the one that watches after me. You're the one that determines the steps of my life. This is not how I would have chosen it. This is not what I would have picked to go through. But this is what you've chosen for me to go through. And I believe that you'll be faithful. And I believe that you will be kind. And I believe that you will be merciful, as Nebuchadnezzar was told, be merciful to the poor. You put yourself in exactly that position. And look at how he finishes it. Verse 36, he says, at that time, my reason returned to me. My majesty and splendor were restored to me. For the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and surpassing greatness was added to me. It means it was even better than it was before. Yeah. And Nebuchadnezzar says in verse 37, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true, and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. This is not a bad statement. Nebuchadnezzar is saying this as a wonderful statement. God's ways are true, or his ways are just. The things that he comes up with, it's absolutely built on truth, on the way it really is. And there's nothing unjust or unkind or unfair about what he does. And God is able, he is capable of humbling those who have been puffed up with pride. Not for their detriment. Nebuchadnezzar is saying, no. It is, did you read the paragraph? It is for their glory. It is to make their lives better. It is to put them in a perspective where they seek God and they look to God and they live in a way that honors God. And life is so much better when all of a sudden that becomes the focus of their life. You go to the New Testament, Jesus comes. Listen, this is why Jesus came. It's both humbling to look at Jesus coming and saying, I can't save myself. I can't rescue myself. I can't look at my life and say my life is good enough. God has to accept me and God has to acknowledge me. I always love it when someone says that. They say, well, I've lived a better life than most. And I always think, where's the grade, right? How much better than most before, God says, oh, you're one that I'm looking to. But instead, God takes you through things in life to cause you to look up and to see him, to see God's mercy and his kindness and his love and his justice, his faithfulness, absolutely. And acknowledging him, acknowledging that God has become our rescuer. And when God sends Jesus, his son, into this world, that's what he's come to do. To rescue us from ourselves, our foolishness, our pride, our arrogance. And then to take who we are and all those things that are components of us and wanting to achieve. Yeah, but to change all those things because we acknowledge God in the midst of those things and we look to Him in the midst of those. Let's pray together. Maybe you're at one of those stages in life where you say, yeah, that's me. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. I just can't find my way. Whatever I do, whatever I achieve is just not enough, and I just feel like, it's never going to be enough. Man, what a great time to look up to the God of heaven. And to acknowledge that He put you here. God knows what you're going through. To acknowledge that, God, I realize you've never taken your eyes off of me or your hand off of my life. But maybe you've taken me through these things. Maybe I'm going through these things so that I would see you in a new way. And the focus of thinking I've got to earn, achieve, have, become, that's going to satisfy me, when the truth is, you're the only way that my life will ever be satisfied. So thank you for sending your Son, for Jesus changing everything. That he would come and live His life on this earth, go through all the same struggles that I go through, and He did. Same disappointments, same mistreatments that I go through. And yet, without sin, He didn't walk away from you. And He did this so that His life could be a sacrifice, a rescue, a redemption of my life, so that I could know you, Father. I could know your hand upon my life. I could live a life doing good things. I could show mercy and compassion to those around me as you have shown mercy and compassion to me. Thank you for your Son, Jesus. In His name I pray.